This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you're watching unfold is quieter than that and far more dangerous, because somewhere along the way, power stopped behaving like governance and started behaving like acquisition, not influence, not leadership, extraction. Money begins to move before the public is told why. Decisions are made before oversight even knows a decision exists. And the justification always comes later, dressed up as necessity. Here's the unsettling part. This isn't chaos. It's a system learning that it can act first, profit immediately, and explain itself never. If you feel like things are accelerating without a clear reason, you're not imagining it. Stay with me. Because once you see how this mechanism actually works, you'll understand why it doesn't stop on its own, and why what looks like strength is quietly hollowing the structure from the inside. Because the next step isn't louder, it's more efficient. What actually controls the system now isn't ideology. It isn't voters. It isn't even strategy. It's velocity. How fast power can convert authority into advantage before anyone can interrupt the process. The center of gravity has shifted away from public debate, away from institutions, towards something leaner and harder to see. A structure where decisions are no longer designed to persuade, but to execute. Where legality becomes a technical obstacle, not a boundary. And where success is measured in immediate return, not long-term stability. In this system, restraint looks like weakness. Delay looks like failure. And accountability becomes a liability to be routed around. That's why personalities don't matter as much as they seem. They're interchangeable. What matters is the operating logic beneath them. Once that logic takes hold, the system stops asking whether it should act and starts asking only whether it can. And if it can act without consequence, it will. The real shift isn't dramatic, it's procedural, and it's already happened. The most dangerous change didn't arrive with an announcement, it arrived as a habit. Before, force was the last option. Now, it's simply an option. Before, legitimacy had to be maintained. Now, it's treated as a public relations problem to manage later. This shift didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly, through repetition, through small exceptions that became normal, through actions that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, now defended as practical. That's how systems fail, not with collapse. With accommodation, each move recalibrates the baseline. Each success teaches the system that resistance is slow and consequences are negotiable. What once required justification now only requires opportunity. And once power learns that it can move faster than scrutiny, it doesn't slow itself down. It accelerates. This is the part most people miss. They're watching individual moves. They're arguing over motives. But the real story is the normalization of speed over restraint. And once that balance flips, the next shock doesn't feel shocking at all. It feels inevitable. Then something happens that pulls the curtain back just for a moment. Markets react before the public understands why. Certain industries surge instantly, not gradually, not cautiously. Immediately, that doesn't happen by accident, because for prices to move that fast, someone had to know first. Someone had to know what was coming. Before oversight, before debate, before explanation. This is where the story stops being abstract. When profit appears ahead of justification, you're no longer looking at policy. You're looking at a signal that power is being exercised not to stabilize a system, but to reward specific outcomes. The shock isn't that money was made. Money is always made. The shock is how cleanly the system absorbed it. No friction, no pause, no visible resistance. If this feels familiar, it should. Because once a system discovers that force can create value on demand, the incentive isn't to slow down. It's to repeat the process. Stay with me. Because the real danger isn't the profit itself. It's where that profit starts to go next. Here's where the system reveals its true shape, because the profit you just saw doesn't sit still. It has to be managed, protected, directed. That requires more than force. It requires architecture. A loop forms. Action creates advantage. Advantage creates revenue. Revenue reinforces the actors who authorize the action in the first place. And because this loop moves faster than public oversight, it starts routing around it entirely. Institutions become decorative. Processes become optional. Transparency becomes something to explain away after the fact. This is how power stops flowing through the system and starts flowing around it. What looks like governance from the outside is actually coordination between force, finance, and access. Not conspiracy. Incentive. The people who benefit don't need to break the system. They just need to use it more efficiently than everyone else. And once that efficiency is proven, the logic spreads. Because now the question is no longer, is this allowed? It's, why wouldn't we do it again? That's the bridge. Because when repetition begins, speed increases. And the next shock doesn't wait for permission. Then the system takes another step. Quieter, more decisive. The money no longer just moves quickly. It moves out of reach. Not into programs, not into budgets, not into places designed to be watched. It moves into spaces where oversight slows down, where accountability becomes technical, where control concentrates instead of dispersing. This is no longer about influence, it's about insulation. Because once revenue is detached from public process, power stops negotiating. It starts operating independently. That's when the balance breaks. The system no longer needs consensus. It doesn't even need explanation. It only needs continuity. And continuity is easier when fewer people are allowed to see the ledger. This is the acceleration point, where the structure stops reacting and starts anticipating shorter timelines. Fewer checks, cleaner execution. From the outside, it still looks like government, but inside, it's something else entirely. A machine that can fund itself, protect itself, and repeat itself. And once a system reaches that stage, the question isn't whether it will be challenged. It's how long before the cost shows up somewhere else. And who ends up paying it? Here's where this stops being abstract. Because the system doesn't pay its costs itself. It passes them on to you. You feel it when priorities shift without explanation. When money is suddenly unavailable for things that used to matter, when the language of urgency replaces the language of care. You're told there isn't enough, not enough time, not enough funding, not enough flexibility. But somehow, there is always enough for acceleration, enough for expansion, enough for force, enough for whatever keeps the machine moving. And if you sense that decisions are being made farther away from you, with fewer opportunities to intervene, that's not distance. That's design. This is how systems protect themselves, by making their consequences diffuse and their benefits concentrated. If this feels familiar in your own life, if you've wondered why stability feels thinner every year, pay attention. Because this structure doesn't just operate abroad. It reshapes the ground under your feet. Share this. Not for outrage, for awareness. Because the next phase doesn't arrive loudly, it arrives normalized. What begins inside one system never stays there. Because power doesn't operate in isolation. It sends signals, and the signal being sent now is not confidence. It's volatility. Partners start recalculating, not out of ideology, out of risk management. When rules become optional, alliances become conditional. What used to be dependable starts to feel expensive, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. So hedging begins, quietly at first, through meetings that don't make headlines, through trade routes that shift a few degrees at a time, through agreements that used to be automatic and now require a backup plan. This is how influence drains away without a confrontation. No dramatic rupture, just a steady redistribution of trust. And into that space, someone else steps forward, not by force, by offering what's suddenly scarce. Stability, continuity, rules that don't change midstream. That doesn't mean the system collapses tomorrow. It means the center moves. And once it moves, it doesn't ask permission to keep going because the world adjusts faster than any one country expects. And the final consequences never arrive where the first decision was made. From here, the system doesn't choose a destination. It chooses a direction, and there are only three paths forward. The first is adjustment. The system recognizes the damage early. Constraints return. Speed slows. Power relearns restraint, not out of virtue, but necessity. This path requires interruption. And interruption requires leverage that hasn't appeared yet. The second path is erosion. Nothing breaks all at once. Institutions keep functioning, technically, but trust thins. Alliances loosen. Oversight becomes symbolic. The system keeps extracting just enough to survive while stability quietly leaks away year after year. And then there's rupture. That's when acceleration outruns control. When self-funding power collides with external reality. When a shock hits a system designed to move fast, not to absorb impact. Rupture doesn't announce itself as failure. It shows up as overreaction, as miscalculation, as a move that can't be walked back. Which path emerges isn't decided by intention. It's decided by feedback, by whether resistance forms, by whether consequences land where power can feel them. And right now, that outcome is unresolved because the system is still moving, and systems moving at this speed rarely stop on their own. So this is where we end, not with a conclusion, with a condition, because the danger isn't that the system fails loudly. It's that it keeps working just well enough to continue a structure that can move fast, fund itself, and route around resistance. Doesn't collapse under pressure, it hardens. And once hardened, it doesn't respond to appeals. It responds only to friction. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. Because if this system continues unchallenged, it doesn't need elections to survive. It doesn't need legitimacy to expand. It only needs momentum. And momentum is easy to maintain when consequences are delayed and costs are exported. Nothing you've heard here guarantees a break. Nothing promises correction. What it does offer is a warning, because systems like this don't reverse course naturally. They change only when forced to confront limits they can't bypass. If you want to understand where those limits might come from, who benefits from delaying them, and what happens when they finally arrive, that's the next layer. And that's where this story actually begins. Stay with it.